The AI is going to supplant many, many jobs, many careers. It's going to do a lot of things that we do now. The AI is going to do.
In the format that Aquinas is imagining, where you can observe stuff and then you trace back the series and it gets you to God, it doesn't fit that at all. So
Inclusivity. So it means if you are in a relationship with others, it means that it presupposes that there is care, and when there is care, there is inclusion of the other.
So you are to tell us why you win and why the opposing team lose.
As to why something is likely to be true. And sometimes in really tough rooms, you can't really dispute the veracity of a certain claim.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sapiens Mindshift, where we tackle science, religion, and different philosophical concepts. I am Jester, your host once again, an undergrad student of philosophy at Visayas State University, together with my co-admins, of course, who made this recording possible. Today, we are joined by another special guest, a professor of philosophy at the Salle University in Manila, and he is none other than Dr. Jeremiah Joaquin, one of the leading analytic philosophers in the Philippines today, especially known for his work in logic and metaphysics. He has written several articles on topics such as dialetheism and Kripke's anti-materialism, and has co-authored books, including Philosophy and What Matters, Knowing More or Less. So Dr. J.J. Joaquin is also a founding research fellow at the Southeast Asian Research Center and Hub, and an associate member of the Birmingham Centre for Philosophy of Religion. His research interests include the philosophy of religion, metaphysics, philosophical logic, and life. So Dr. J.J. Joaquin, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to Sapiens Mindshift.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
All right. So Dr. JJ, I think before we begin with some preliminary questions about the history of logic, I'm quite curious, just like all the other students listening to this episode, about what made you decide to pursue philosophy. So was there any question or experience that struck you or perhaps made you realize that philosophy was more than just a mere subject?
I like the question very much. Actually, I'm writing an autobiography, a memoir about my journey in philosophy. The title of that book is My Philosophical Adventures and the Philosophers I Met Along the Way. Now, so let me share how I got into the pursuit of academic philosophy. So I got into philosophy by accident, actually. I was not hoping to be a professional academic philosopher. I was trained to be a Catholic priest with the Dominicans in the late 1990s. But when that didn't pan out, my superiors, the learned Dominicans, sent me to pursue an undergraduate philosophy course at Colegio de San Juan de la Torre. So I ended up in a Dominican school to study philosophy. But what inspired me to really get into philosophy, I think, when I was younger, maybe around 12, I love reading things like history from ancient Greeks to modern times. I also love mathematics. So mathematics is one of my favorite subjects, especially the theoretical bits of it, not just the arithmetic bits. And the good marriage of history and mathematics is logic and philosophy. So I got into that, especially when I tried reading Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy. So that's one of my inspirations. And I got into reading the history of Western philosophy. Yeah, so I was hooked. So right now, I've been doing philosophy for almost, 25 years now, since being a professional academic philosopher. So, yeah.
All right, beautiful. Okay, so now let's begin with this very important question, of course. Before we talk about complicated concepts and important figures such as the Stoics, Frege and his invention of predicate logic, I think it is very crucial to start with the question of the nature of logic itself as a field of study. So maybe we should begin with this first question, which concerns its main focus, its
Mm.
purpose. So, Dr. JJ, let me ask you this question. It's actually a two-part question. What is logic, and what is the point of doing logic?
Okay, so for me, logic is the study of validity. So when logicians are thinking about logic, they're thinking about it in terms of what follows from what and why. So a good way of putting it is to think about information flow. So here's one bit of information that I'm Filipino. So how can I say that I'm Filipino? Well, because you have a Filipino birth certificate. Now you'll ask, why? What does it mean to have a birth certificate? Well, because my parents are Filipino. I was born in Filipino. So now the conclusion that I have that I'm Filipino is based from two other sets of information. Like I have a Filipino birth certificate and I have Filipino parents and I was born in the Philippines. So logicians ask, how does that thing that you're Filipino, the conclusion, follow from those other sets of information? Having a Filipino birth certificate and having Filipino parents. How does that piece of information lead to another set of information? That's what logic is all about. Now, nowadays, you know, now that we're having impeachment, the impeachment of VP Sara Duterte, you hear a lot of things that the judges, the senator judges, the prosecution and the defense lawyers are talking about. Right? They're talking about whether this thing that you're claiming that VP Sara violated the constitution or betrayed public trust. And the prosecution now wants to give reasons for that. The defense, of course, wants to deny that connection. But that's a question of logic. Here's my piece of information, here's my claim, and how is that grounded on some other claims, like here's a public threat or whatever, grave threat, and so on. So logicians, professional logicians like me, like other professional logicians, are looking for that connection between those two things: the conclusion, claim that you have, and the set of premises or the starting information that. Now, why is that important? Logic is important. Actually, I'm one of those advocates who want to bring back logic in tertiary education. So why is logic important? Because logic is not just about, what follows from what, it's also about thinking and reasoning. How can we guarantee that our reasoning, our thinking is a good one, it's a correct one, and not a bad one or an incorrect one? So logicians will teach you the principles of correct reasoning, the rules of inference, and so on and so forth. That's why. That's point studying logic for me, at least. Now, if you want to be a lawyer, you want to be an engineer, you want to be a computer scientist, in the advertising industry, you need those things because whenever you're asked, why do you think that? Well, because here's my reason. And you need to be sure that your reasons guarantee that your claim or your conclusion is right. And that's why the logical principle.
Exactly, right. So basically, logic chief concern, you know, it's inference, right? And by inference, I mean the process of moving from one statement to another. And this is a very important thing because when people think about arguments in general, they think that it's just a mere collection of statements, which we call the premises and the conclusion, right? And they tend to miss a very important element, which we call as inference, the one that would establish the conclusion by bridging these propositions together. So yeah, I do actually have a follow-up question for you here. And yeah, because when people talk about validity, right, the notion of validity is very central in formal logic. They often confuse or blur the distinction between factual error and error in reasoning. And I think this is a very important distinction that Aristotle made in his prior analytics. He wanted to separate a pattern of deductive reasoning from its subject matter, because failure to acknowledge the distinction can lead us to other forms of erroneous reasoning. And this is a common mistake among lay people, even surprisingly among students of philosophy, right? So
even lawyers, actually, even lawyers, even senator judges make those factual mistakes. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So, yeah. So, what's the question?
So, yeah, the question here is that why is it important to separate arguments from its content or subject matter? Dr. JJ.
Yeah, I like the question very much because as we have seen, and again, I can't help but think about the impeachment case that's going on right now. Because you're right, Lynch, people are confusing the factual claims, the truth claims within a particular argument. So an argument is just a collection of sentences of which one is said to follow from the others. Okay? So we mentioned that the claim will be the conclusion and the rest, the support, will be the premises. Now, people confuse sometimes the material or the content of the argument and the form of the argument. That's why in law or in the impeachment trial, you know, they talk about you have the correct form, but you have a false statement, or you have true statements, but it's an incorrect form. So they're distinguishing between the structure of the argument as opposed to the claims inside the argument, the truth claims inside the argument. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of an argument which has true premises, okay, true statements all throughout, but it's a bad argument because it's an invalid. So, classic example: if it rains, the ground is wet. The ground is wet, therefore it rained. And so that's a classic example of an invalid argument because now you are affirming the consequent part of the conditional, that if it rains, the ground is wet, and I saw that the ground is wet, therefore it rained. Why doesn't that follow the conclusion that that it rained follows from the premises that you started out with? Well, because there's a counterfactual scenario wherein yes, the ground is wet, but it did not rain. Maybe someone spilled a lot of water there in the ground. That's why it's wet. Okay? So that's a scenario wherein you could have true premises, right? But you have a false conclusion. Okay? So the question of logic, the question of formal decisions is to look at the structure that guarantees that whenever you have true premises, you'll have a true conclusion. Now, I'll give you another example. An example wherein you have a false premise, right? But you have a true conclusion, but the argument is still formally valid. So here's a good example that I really love to think about. If you study in this class, you'll pass. You studied, therefore you pass. Now, let's suppose that you did not pass actually this class. So factually, the conclusion that you passed the course is false. But the argument is still valid. Because the structure, if I studied this course, I'll pass. I studied, therefore I pass, is a valid structure. So when logicians tell you that you need to separate, or when people tell you, the professional academic philosophers tell you that you need to separate formal validity as opposed to the material or the content of the argument, they're asking you to distinguish between what we may call the formal structure of the argument and the soundness of the. When you're concerned about soundness, you're also concerned about the truth of the starting premises here. So yeah, that's a very good question to ask here. And a lot of people are confusing those two things because I think one of the psychological studies that was designed in, when was that, in the 1980s and the 1990s, there's a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is that if you know that a particular proposition or claim is true, regardless of what reasons you may have for that truth, you'll say that that argument is valid because you have a true proposition. You're starting with a true proposition. So you're just confirming what you already know. And you're not really justifying, you're providing reasons for that. So that's an important distinction that, well, people in general should make. Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, no worries. So basically, the first case was the classic case of affirming the consequent, and the other is the
Affirming.
affirming the antecedent, right? So yeah, you have
Yeah, the second case is to be technical about it, the modus ponens
modus
argument.
ponens.
Modus
Yeah, it's
ponens.
the modus ponens. Okay, so yeah, Shane, I think that we should begin to the man who started it all, of course. And he is none other than Aristotle himself. So maybe a little background to our genius. So Aristotle was born in Stagira, Greece. He was the son of Nicomachus, a medical expert and a personal physician to the king of Macedonia, which explains a lot because of his father's close connection with the royal court. Aristotle enjoyed access to the finest education and knowledge available in his time from a very young age. He was also a student of, you know, you know, Plato, and would later on become the teacher of Alexander the Great, right? So now I think I should ask you this question, Dr. JJ, because among all these achievements, which is his legendary creation of syllogistic logic, can you explain to us what is syllogistic logic and what do you think is the primary motivation of Aristotle for building that system of logic?
Okay, so I'll go first with the motivation, Aristotle's motivation. Now, ancient Greece, let's look back. So, by the way, we're talking about the history of logic. So, this is 2,500 years. We'll try to condense in this episode. So, Aristotle was born in this moment in history wherein a lot of people are the wise people. A lot of they call them the sophists, and you have the skeptics there, you have the rhetoricians, you have the lawyers, and all of them are in the agora or the public market, public space. And so whenever you have disputes, it's a public dispute. So when Socrates, for example, gave lectures, it's not really in the classroom setting; it's more in the agora, in the public market. Okay. So the sophists, skeptics, and the rhetoricians and the lawyers are all there talking about whatever. And they're trying to convince people that some claim is true. Actually, the funny thing about those people is that they try to convince other people that some weird false claim is true. And they do that via, their rhetorical style. So this is where someone like Socrates, someone like Plato, someone like Aristotle will say there's something wrong with that kind of reason. So the motivation of these people, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, is to systematize reasoning. Let's think about reasoning in a way that when lawyers talk about things, we want to say that their true claims lead to true conclusions, right? Or their true statements lead to other truths. So that's the motivation, how to systematize a body of reasoning that these people, the sophists, the skeptics, the rhetoricians, are trying to do in the agora. So that's the primary thing that Aristotle did. So what's his theory of logic here? Well, Aristotle is the father of logic, at least in the Western civilization. So his Greek and most of the logis or logos that we know, biology, cosmology, physics, and so on, are from Aristotle. So Aristotle is one of the pioneers of logic. But even before him, there are other people like Isocrates, Demosthenes. Okay? Those are predecessors of Aristotle. Those were the greats, the great rhetoricians, the great sophists of his time. What Aristotle did was to write up all the rules or all the principles in a book, a textbook that he gave to his students. He gave to Alexander the Great. He gave to Theophrastus, one of his later students, to Eudemus, and the other Peripatetics. That's the school of thought that he developed. So Aristotle's theory is found in his collection of his books, the organon or a tool. So for Aristotle, logic is just a tool that philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, and all those craps people use to propound truths from truths. So how do you arrive at new truths from a given set of truths by necessity? And he calls that syllogisms or the syllogism. So syllogism is just a basic idea of deduction. So you have a general set of truths. You know these truths because of For example, observation of nature, observation of animals, observation of whatever. And from those principles, you gain new truths. Okay? So that's the syllogism part. But before getting into the syllogism part, the syllogismus idea, you need to construct a language to really think about these things. And that is where the categories will come. So he has this book, part of the organon, known as the categories. Think of the categories as a set of ways of talking about things. So he has 10 categories. Thinking about the categories of Aristotle, like substance, accidents, relations, quantity, quality, and so on and so forth. So those are things that you could categorize things. So these are big categories that we could categorize things. I'm thinking of it in terms of grammar. So right now we're talking about, this podcast. How do we know that this is a podcast? Because it's characterized by a given set of properties, like being recorded in a video, having conversations with other people, and so on. I'm saying that this is a podcast. This thing now is a podcast because it's part of that genus or that category. Right? So that's Aristotle's category. So it's a set of, terms, and how you classify things using those terms. Now, he also has that theory of interpretation or theory of judgment, and that's in the on interpretation. So he has another book as part of the organon known as the Interpretazione, where he classified judgments. Okay, so you have terms in your grammar, your categories, and you have judgments from those categories. That this is a podcast, or that you are a student, that I am a teacher. Those are judgments or assertions that you make from those things that now in the categories. Now he distinguishes between different types of judgments. You have the assertoric, the things that you assert, the things that you deny, or you could have modal assertions or modal judgments, like it's possible that I'm eating right now, or pigs fly, possibly, right, and so on. So those are modal. And you have temporal judgments as well. So Aristotle is sensitive. Aristotle's logic is sensitive to the temporal truths of the statement. For example, that we are doing a podcast. So this is true now. It wasn't true an hour ago, and it won't be true this evening that we're doing a podcast now. So that's another type of judgment. Now he adds judgments. Okay? So after you have your grammar, you have a theory of judgment. Now you could think about how judgments connect with one another. So that's the prior and posterior analytics. When you think about how now that we are in a podcast, because we're doing this thing, and this thing belongs to this category of podcasting. Okay. So that's a kind of deduction that you will eat later. This lunch is a kind of induction, and so on. Okay, so those are things that Aristotle discussed in his posterior and prior. Finally, you have another two works inside the organon. So the topics and the sophistical refutations. Topics is just dialectics, the rules of the argument, how we argue, how we how we categorize the topics inside the argument. Is this a factual disagreement? Are you talking about something of value? Is this debate about a value, or is this debate about a policy, and so on? So those are the topics. Okay, and what are the good ways of arguing for or against a particular claim within the given topic? And finally, sophistical refutations is just you know the informal fallacies that we know now, like the ad hominem, the ad baculum, ad populum, and those other Latin terms that later I'll talk about that, who coined those terms. But those are basically Aristotle's contribution to logic. He gave us a way, a language of thinking about how to judge whether a conclusion follows from a premise. Because of the grammar, because of the classification of judgments, and because of the rules of the syllogism that he talked about in the organic. It's a bit long, but yeah. Now, but it's also good for if you want to get into the history of Aristotle. The Aristotle that we know now is not Aristotle. Just to that's weird to think about, honestly. But the Aristotelian logic that we learn in school isn't Aristotle, right? It's the rules that we know that we attribute to Aristotle is actually from, I think, two of his students, like Theophrastus and Euthymus. So those two are the heirs of Aristotle. So when Aristotle died, these two students became the heads of the two peripatetic schools. And they added some versions of logic, Aristotelian logic. And later in the medieval times, you'll also see that. But again, here in Aristotle, you're concerned about syllogisms, what follows from what, but you need to highlight the categories, judgments, and how they form into an argument. I hope that's all right.
Right. Perfect. Perfect. So basically, his logic was primarily concerned with general terms, right? Which is like the propositional logic of the Stoics. Was it?
The best way of thinking about Aristotle is to think about him, at least the original prior analytics, is think about it in terms of categorical arguments or syllogistic arguments. So, for example, if I say that I am mortal, I will die, right? So that's the conclusion. Why do I say that? Well, because I'm a human being and all human beings die. So that's a syllogism. So you have the conclusion, I will die. That's true of all of us. Why? Because we are all human beings and all human beings will die. So notice that the category human being, right, is a category, and I belong to that category, and that category has another property, namely being mortal or will die. So that's how the syllogism will work. So yeah, what I like about that is if you think about it, lawyers use that kind of reasoning as well. If you look at the impeachment trial, they'll say this is a piece of grave threat because it has these elements, and these elements will be part of what makes the category grave threat, right? So lawyers use this kind of reasoning. That's why, again, Aristotle's motivation was to systematize that kind of thinking, systematize or formalize how lawyers should think, how engineers, biologists, chemists should think. They should think in terms of categories, right? And how those categories connect.
Right. But I think also one unique the feature of Aristotle's categorical propositions is that they assume existence, right? The so-called existential import, which, later on we'll find very troubling because of these square of opposition wherein you have this universal affirmative proposition that involves the truth of particular affirmative propositions. But later on, these kind of relations will no longer work, and we will find it out. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that one.
Yeah.
So do you have anything to add up before we move on, Dr. JJ?
Now I'm thinking about that existential assumption. Yeah, that's right. So for Aristotle, if you say that all human beings will die, he's assuming that there are human beings. Yeah, and they will die. All right, that's right. That's right.
Okay, all right. So, okay, thank you so much for that one. So now, not long after Aristotle came the Stoics, actually a group of philosophers who dominated philosophy during the Hellenistic period, alongside the Epicureans and the skeptics. So basically, they famously claim that philosophy has three parts. They call it physics, logic, and ethics. And they treated logic as something foundational, basically prior to physics and ethics. I was correct. And logic, according to them, is a kind of a protective shell that allows us to inquire into the good life, how we ought to live in the nature of reality, like what is real, for example, as their famous egg analogy suggests. So for Stoic, logic first, for ethics and physics. So perhaps a good way to start this, Dr. JJ, is that what is Stoic logic and how is it different to Aristotelian logic?
Okay, so again, we're condensing a lot of history there. So it's about 300 years, 500 years from Aristotle to the Stoics. But let's try to think about this. The Stoics famously were, to be a Stoic is to really be, don't really care about material things. Let things be. That's being a Stoic, right? But the Stoics are not just, letting things be. That's not the point. Their point was we need to gain ataraxia or tranquility of life. So how do we have tranquility? By being mindful. And how can we achieve mindfulness? We need to be logicians. And so a lot of Stoics were logicians. Like there's this guy Zeno. It's one of the pioneers of Stoicism. But there are three guys who really pioneered Stoic logic as we know it now. So there's Diodorus Cronus, Philo, and Chrysippus. Okay, so let's imagine that we're moving towards the common era. We're in between BCE and CE. So during this time, Christianity is coming in the picture. And during this time, Aristotle has been dominating all schools of thought. Here come now the Stoics. And the Stoics, as opposed to Aristotle, were more concerned about the statements themselves. So they're not treating judgments or statements as something that you could break into categories. They're treating them as what they call the lecta, or the content itself of thought. When you think about that this is a podcast, they're not thinking about it in terms of here's the podcasting category and here's the thing now that we're doing. So that's not how the Stoics will think about the statement, this is a podcast. They'll think about it as a simple claim, a simple proposition that this is a podcast. And they want to say, how does that thing relate with some other thing? So instead of thinking of statements that could be broken into categories of whatever, they're thinking about it as an atomic thing, which they call right now we're calling it a simple proposition or an atomic proposition. But during their time, they're calling it a lecta or the main components of thought. But the good thing about the Stoics is that if that's the atom of thought. Propositions, whole propositions are the atom of thought. Then you can think about their relationship with one another. So it's not just a categorical statement like all F's or G's or some F's or G's or whatever. Now we could think about hypothetical things like if this is the case, then that's the case. Or a disjunction like either this is the case or that's the case. Or a conjunction of things that this is the case and that's the case. So now those elements will come into logic. So a while ago when we were talking about Aristotle, we're talking about it in terms of categories and how categories relate to one another. Right now, it's called first order logic or predicate logic. For the Stoics, the baseline of thought is the proposition itself. So they'll say that here we could have hypothetical or conditionals, you could have disjunctive, you could have conjunctive, and so on. And let's see how those things could give us certain truths. Like Aristotle, the Stoics are also concerned about what follows from what. But the point of the analysis is no longer the categories, but the lecta themselves. I hope that helps.
All right. Yeah. They take propositions as atomic. Like they reduce it into P instead of, trying to analyze it using the subject and predicate, something like that. And also, just to add up one thing that because this fascinates me, and this concerns the notion of the assertables, which we now call as propositions in Stoic logic, right? So according to the Stoics, propositions do not exist like the way how body does, that occupies space and time. Proposition, according to them, or according to their view, it's an incorporeal thing. Although it doesn't exist the same way as the body or material things does, but one thing for sure, they do exist at least in some sense. That's why they introduce a new category of existence to characterize their mode of being, which they call a subsistence, right? They do subsist according to them. So, right. So can you please explain to us what is subsistence, at least, Dr. JJ? What do you mean by subsistence?
All right, so let's not that kind of stoicism as I think the Chrysippus line. So there are a lot of Stoics. So you have
Okay.
the Philo Stoic logic, you have the Chrysippus logic. So here's one way of looking at it. Instead of thinking about it in terms of existence and subsistence, you could think about it in terms of whether your judgments or statements are really about the world or about something else. Hi. So when I say that this is a podcast or this is a cell phone or whatever judgment that you're making, Stoics will ask, is it about the reality it tries to depict or is it something else? For Chrysippus, at least, he'll think about it in terms of, well, it's in the mind. It's a kind of mental language that we use. Actually, the medieval philosophers later will try to pick that up in their discussions of logic. But the basic idea is, for Aristotle, you could divide up the propositions or the categorical statements or whatever statement into categories because he's looking at those statements as real features of the world. That this is a podcast is true because this thing that we're doing now belongs to that category that's in the actual world. Stoics don't have that kind of metaphysics in their system. They'll just say, okay, so we have that statement. We concretize that using our voice, we're using our words, but what it depicts is not reality itself. Something else. That's why for Stoics, this is the ethical part that you talked about a while ago. The world won't hurt me. What's happening in the world won't hurt me because I'm independent of the world. The good things or the bad things are not found in the world. They're just states of mind, something to that effect. So that's why, as you can see, they have a different way of looking at not just logic, but also how you should live your life. But let's go back to the logic part because I don't want to go to the ethics part. The logic part, the funny thing is that they considered some of the old paradoxes that stumped the Aristotelians. So one such so let's go back a bit. So still Aristotle, so we're still in Aristotle's logic, and there's a kind of realism involved. That's what you call the existential claim. So they for Aristotle, all human beings will die is true because there are human beings and they will die. But one skeptic, his name was Eubulides, proposed that wait, that's a weird way of looking at how we speak. Because, for example, here's my favorite one from Eubulides. So he presented several paradoxes that really stumped the Aristotelians, which didn't stump the Stoics. So here's one. Do you believe, Lynch, that whatever you don't lose, you still have?
Perhaps
You believe
yes.
that? Yes.
Yeah.
Whatever you don't lose, you still have, right? That's a basic thing. So if you did not lose your pen, you still have your pen. If you did not lose your cell phone, you still have your cell phone. So that's true. A true principle. Whatever you did not lose, you still have. But you did not lose horns, right? So via logic, Aristotle's logic, you need to conclude that you still have them. You still have horns. So Eubulides will say, that's silly. So you have a starting premise, right? You don't have horns. That's true. And whatever you did not lose, you still have. He said that it's true. So therefore, using Aristotle's logic, it follows that you still have horns. Obviously, you're led from true premises to a false conclusion. So something has gone wrong. So the Stoics would say the problem was we accepted the first principle that whatever you did not lose, you still have. And why are you accepting that proposition? Well, that principle? Well, because you're assuming that that's about reality. It's not about reality, right? So the Stoics would say there's something wrong with that because it presumes some kind of reality in the first place. But that's not the case. Same goes for the liar paradox. So Eubilides also produced this. I think you know this, the liar paradox. So if I say this statement is false, is it true? For Aristotle's group, the Peripatetics, they'll say, oh, that's weird because if that statement is true, then it is false. Right? So if this statement is again, this statement is false. So if that's true, what it says is true. It says of itself that it's false. So if it is true, it's false. Then that can't be right. So it must be false. But wait, if the statement that this statement is false, then what it says doesn't hold. So if it is false, it must be true. So that's weird, right? But again, the Stoics and later some of the medieval logicians and later Kurt Gödel will use this apparatus, right, to think about probability, completeness, and soundness, and etc. But again, the Stoics will say there's something wrong here because you're presuming that the statement is about reality, but it's not. It's about lecta. It's about propositions, nothing more. Okay, so you're seeing the difference between the Aristotelians here and the Stoics on the other hand, which is fun. And finally, the Sorites paradox, the heap paradox. So a grain of sand is made out of, let's suppose, 100,000 grains of sand. If you lose one, you still have a heap, right? So whenever you lose one grain in a heap of sand, you still have a heap. But if you run that argument, okay, to 100,000 times, you'll end up saying that a heap without any grain of sand is still a heap, which is weird. That's why for Chrysippus, I think for Philo as well, they'll say, those are silly things that won't lead you to a tranquil life, to ataraxia. So let's forget about it because that's nonsense for them, at least. But again, the crucial thing for the Stoics is that because you're assuming Aristotle and the rest of the gang are assuming that sentences are about or statements are about real things, real categories of things. So that's the distinction that the Stoics will say that's not our philosophy. I hope that helps.
Right, right. And also, was it also true that generally propositions that Stoics endorsed are tense propositions? Was it generally the propositions are tense propositions?
Yes. So there's the other Stoic that I did not discuss him, the Diodorus Chronos. So he has this weird argument known as the master argument. Basically, it just gives you a contradiction if you forget about the tense of the sentences. If you don't factor in tenses in your sentences, in your judgment of sentences, then you'll be mistaken. For example, if I say that I'm still eating right now, that's false because I'm not eating. Okay. If I conclude from there, then therefore someone is eating, that's valid, but you you came from a false proposition and ended up with a true proposition. So that's valid, but it's an unsound. So if you're not sensitive about the tenses of your sentences, that will be a problem as well. But as I've said, though, the Stoics have different ways of thinking about it. Chrysippus has a different weird logic and metaphysics there. He's more of a nominalist, if you're familiar with the term. So for Chrysippus, I think, and some other Stoics would say, well, our statements are just, air, voces, right? Yeah. Flatus voces here. It's just words. They're not about things in the world. I'm not for that, by the way.
Okay, yeah. Well, you mentioned the otherness Chronos. He has this very interesting view about implication because for him, true conditionals aren't just true, but must necessarily be true. While for Chrysippus, on the other hand, implications aren't just, true functional, right? For Chrysippus, implications must require real, genuine causal, logical connection for it to be true. Otherwise, because he would like to avoid these counterintuitive instances wherein you get these, consider, for example, a modus ponens case, right? You have a material implication.
Mhm.
If 1 + 1 = 2, then the sky is blue. Although they are related, right? There's no any real logical or causal connection between the antecedent and the consequent. Yeah, still get a valid argument. But for Chrysippus, however, this is not allowed. This is nonsense, right? Because he has this kind of a scientific view of reality, in which
Yeah,
for him, conditionals must capture reality, basically.
well, that's one way of reading the Chrysippus line. Another way of reading about it is that conditionals must be a strong relationship between the antecedent and the consequent. They should have, as you have said, a causal relation with one another. That's different from Philo, because Philo would say that even a conditional which has a false proposition, false antecedent, will be true for Philo. And I think Diodorus as well. So it will be fun to really think about
Yeah,
conditionals, right?
right.
Because that is a big subject in current philosophical logic. But yeah, you're right. So Chrysippus would take conditionals as a true conditional will be a stronger relationship between the antecedent and the consequent. It might be causal, it might be a necessary relationship. Philo would not have that, because Philo is the relationship between the if part and the then part of a conditional is a weak relationship.
Right.
Yeah,
It's just like, it's much more simpler, theoretically speaking, if you have a material implication rather than these sort of,
the stronger implications.
right,
Actually, I
exactly.
have a paper on this one. So I thought about if you have a really weak way of thinking about conditionals, you could have, a good system of logic wherein conditionals can be defined in terms of negations and disjunctions, or negations and conjunctions. So the system will be a closed system, as opposed to like a Chrysippus line, which will add another layer of meaning to conditionals. So conditionals for Chrysippus will be doing multiple work. So it's not just a material implication, it's also a causal relation, it's also a necessary relation. But from a modern logician's point of view, that will be, not a simple system to work.
Right. Okay. Okay. Perfect. So now let's move forward to the Middle Ages. We talk a
Yes.
lot about Stoics, by the way. Okay, which is actually one of the most misunderstood periods in the history of philosophy because of the so-called Dark Ages, right? I think it's a misnomer. So that label has led many people to think that philosophy and logic somehow went into decline after the fall of the ancient world. In fact, it was quite the opposite. So during this era, medieval philosophers didn't just manage to preserve Aristotle logic, right? But they also innovated, Aristotle logic in a remarkable ways. So there were several prevailing thinkers during this time, like Peter, Abelard, William, Burden, and many others who developed what we now call as terminist logic. So
Mm.
now, Dr. JJ, can you give us an overview of what medieval terminist logic, why it's so significant, by the way?
All right. So medieval logic spans from about 800 years. So it's not just a simple, roughly, so from 100, sorry, right about 20 AD to 20 CE to 14th century, 15th century. So that's the span of medieval logic. Okay, so before getting into medieval logic, let's have a brief interlude. So you have the Peripatetics, the Aristotelian logicians, and you have the Stoics on the other hand. So these two boys and girls were at it. So they're discussing in the Agora, which is the right logic. The Peripatetics will say Aristotle's syllogisms will be the best logic. The Stoics would say no, it's Chrysippus or it's Philo's logic, which is the best logic. Now, those two things merged, right? Before the turn of the Common Era, there's this guy. His name was, I think, I don't know how to pronounce it. in the original Latin. So I'll just use the modern Latin that we're using. So Cicero, or Cicero in the old Latin, I think. Cicero was I think, one of the bridges between what we know now as the old logic, or what the medievals called the logica antiqua or logica vetus, right, as opposed to logica moderna or modercana or whatever. The logic of the moderns, which for them is the current, and the Aristotle's logic. But during Cicero's time, he that's when these two logics, the Stoic logic and the peripatetic logic, the Aristotelian logic, merged into one logic. I'd like to highlight Cicero, not because he's a great orator or rhetorician. He's a great statesman, as you know. He wrote a lot of books about being a statesman, being a politician, but he also wrote the definitive textbook which merged these two logics into one. And he called this one as a kind of Latinization. So Stoics were writing in Greek, and Aristotle's logic was in Greek. So when Cicero came to the scene of logic, he was translating most of these works into Latin. So this is not the Christian Latin of the medievals. This is still the classical Latin, the Roman Latin, pre Christianity here. All right, so what did Cicero give us? Cicero gave us the term propositio, affirmo, nego, ad hominem, ad verecundiam, those terms that we're using right now, like the non sequitur and what's that? Subpoena, ducis tecum, and so on. Those are from Caesar. He was the original guy who gave us the language, the Latin language of what we have now in modern debates. So that's him. And he and this other guy, Boethius, and of course the Arabs like Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, Averroes, Avicenna, they gave us the transmission of the works of Aristotle and the Stoics to the medieval period. So think about that. So from Aristotle, the Stoics, you have this bridge, these people, Cicero, Boethius, even Galen, right, the father of medicine, quote and unquote, father, another gender insensitive term. Yeah, Galen, they really defined logic as the medievals know them. Okay, so let's go to their contributions. All right, so you mentioned Peter Abelard, Peter of Spain. By the way, Peter of Spain became a pope. I don't know if you know. Uh-huh. There's also this guy, William of Sherwood, Aquinas, of course, William of Ockham, Jean Buridan, even Bonaventure, I think, has some logical treatises. Actually, some people right now in professional logicians talk about modern logic, 20th century, 21st century, 20th century and the 21st century logic as a kind of revival of the medieval logic. Because during the medieval time, as you've said, it's not the Dark Ages. It's actually a refinement of all the things that we have learned 1,000 years prior from Aristotle, from the Stoics, and so on. So, what's the the basic theories that we get from the medievals? You have a lot. So, the logic that someone like Jean Buridan, William Sherwood, and Peter Abelard are using is a logic that stems from actually four theories. So one theory is the theory of suppositio, or the theory of reference and meaning and signification. So they're asking, so one crucial question that the medievals asked was, what do we really say when we say a particular sentence? When we claim something, what do we mean by those things? So if you want to trace the history of philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, and the apparatus that we're using, it came from the medievals' theory of suppositio, or reference or of signification. They also have a cool theory about consequentia, the consequence relation, and they have a rule for our theory of obligations in a dialectical scenario. So they have that as well. But the thing is, they codified not just Aristotle, not just the Stoics, but also new ways of thinking about some other kinds of logical relationships, like equivalence, like this consequence relation, like they formalized the contrary, the square of oppositions you talked about. Aristotle didn't have that. It was in the medievals, actually Cicero, who really thought about the AEIO, the categories that we know. For Aristotle, there are only three. Let's go back to Aristotle. There were only three categorical statements. You have the universal, you have the particular, and you have the negation of the universal. He does not have the O proposition. Right? That's why he has a different set of rules. It was during Peter Abelard's time, I think Peter of Spain, actually, and William of Sherwood, those two people gave us the Barbara, Celarent, the Rii, Ferio, those mnemonics. It came from the medievals. It did not come from Aristotle. It's not Aristotelian. It was a medieval invention. And that's where I think the genius of the priests, the medieval priests, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and so on, really paved the way to what we know as logic right now. I hope that helps. So I'm trying to condense a lot of things here, but the basic idea is that, yeah, they're not just transmitters of knowledge. They were reformulating Aristotle and the Stoics in a more comprehensive.
Right. Exactly. And also, and just to add up, according to the textbook that I've read, logic in this period was kind of a linguistic tool used by biblical scholars to assist them in textual exegesis, right? That is interpreting passages in the Bible, right?
Yeah, in a way. So I think you got that from Aquinas as well. So Aquinas was one of those who used logic to really think about how to express faith. So this is the project of bridging faith and reason, right? How can you explain the Trinity or explain the doctrine of incarnation and so on using this kind of logical devices? So that's one. They actually also talked about the problem of universals. So, one passage in Aristotle that really gave people a headache since Aristotle wrote them is, you can talk about a lot of things, okay? Because we have universal terms for those things. But what are those things? What are those universal terms? Like, for example, if I say we are human beings, so being human is something that belongs to you and it belongs to me. But what does that mean? Is humanity part of you, part of me? Where is humanity? So that's something that Boethius introduced in the literature. And so that's a problem of universals. So how can you have this big term, humanity? How do you interpret humanity? Is it something that adheres in you and adheres in someone else? But if that's the case, then the universal can exist in a lot of places, which is weird, right? If it's a real thing and so on. So those are really interesting philosophical conundrums that the medievals were trying to, you know, think about during those times. And by the way, what's good about the medievals like Jean Buridan and Roger Bacon is that their tools were used by moderns like Descartes, later Newton, in ushering in the scientific revolution. So we won't have the scientific revolution without the medievals. If you buy that story, I'm buying that because I don't think that Aquinas and the rest of the medievals were in the dark ages and they don't know what they're talking about.
Right, exactly. And also maybe the other thing that what makes medieval logic, different to Aristotelian logic is that they have a theory of consequence, while on the other hand, Aristotle lacked this general kind of theory of consequence. Like we have these implication, derivation, and
Yeah. So
entail.
yeah, as I've said, medievals further formalize the theory of consequentia. So that's consequence relation. Because for Aristotle, that's just the syllogismo. The
Yeah.
syllogism. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So now, all right, perfect. So now we move on, I think, to one of the most interesting philosopher of all time, and that is, of course, none other than Leibniz, a polymath. So Leibniz contributed not just to the field of logic, but also to mathematics, theology, science, and many more. So most people know him as an inventor of calculus, right? But also beyond that, he has this kind of a bigger dream, which was to create a universal language that everyone could share, whether you're a scientist, a mathematician, or philosopher whatsoever. So now, Dr. JJ, what do you think was Leibniz's greatest contribution to the field of logic?
Not much. Joke. Okay, so Leibniz was I think, the epitome of modern logic, as I've said. So let's try to bridge, or let's try to move from the medievals to the Leibniz conception of logic. So during the medievals, they're debating about the consequence relation, they're debating about a lot of things, but within the context, actually, the background thing there is the theology they're trying to think about, right? But now came in Francis Bacon with his Novum Organum. You have Rene Descartes and his new way of reconceptualizing philosophy, and what's that? Doing away with first principles and really re-establishing how to think about things. You have Blaise Pascal, you have Christian Huygens, you have Fermat, and so on and so forth. So those big scientists of the modern age were trying to rediscover, or not really rediscover, trying to fit the naturalistic standpoint to logic. And so logic during this time was, prior to the scientific revolution, logic was just used by, people like the priests, the lawyers, right? So those are the humanities people. Now, when the scientific revolution happened, like from Francis Bacon up, okay, they're using now another tool, another use of logic was how to systematize all the body of knowledge into one language. Now, Leibniz will come in because he will say, well, logic is not, just the rules of principles of Aristotle. It's actually a characteristic language, a universal language. He calls it the characteristica universalis, that everyone, all the scientists, will use in the sciences, so that a physicist will understand each other because they're using the same language. That's the basic notion that Leibniz really gave to logic. Actually, if you want to really push Leibniz's contribution to logic, it's that basic idea that you could use logic in really tracking all the scientific developments. That's why the calculus, which he discovered or co-discovered with Newton, was really a language to talk about reality, right? A kind of mathematical way of thinking about reality. And here is the turning point in the development of logic. Why? Because before Leibniz, before the creation of Frege pool, all logic was written in words. We talk about logic as, principles of, here's the big sentences, how to connect the sentences. During Leibniz time, now we're becoming more mathematical. Now we're becoming more scientific. It's not just an art, right? It's no longer an art, it's also a science. I hope that helps. And by the way, Leibniz is also known for his identity laws, the
Yeah,
Leibniz
yeah,
law, right? So if two
right.
things are identical, then whatever property one has, the other thing has, right? That's
Was it
due to
right? Was
Leibniz.
it that trying to reduce the qualitative, properties into, numerical identity
Yeah,
from they
yeah.
share the same,
That's
Trotsky's quote.
that's a controversial identity of indiscernible. So if two things have the same property, they're one and the same thing, which I
Right.
think is, well, metaphysically questionable. But the Leibniz law is just the thing that the statement, sorry, the principle that if two things are identical, then whatever property one has, the other thing has. That's,
Uh,
I think, a
mhm.
valid principle. But the identity of indiscernibles, another law that's derived from Leibniz, will tell you that if two things, you can't distinguish two things, they're one and the same. Well, I'm not
Right.
sure that that's right.
Right.
But yeah,
And right. So Parkinson, I don't know if you're familiar with Parkinson, right? He called Leibniz as first ever symbolic logician, right? However,
me,
because most of his writings, right, were published late or after symbolic logic had been independently established by authors in the 19th century, he wasn't really considered as one. So the kind of sad
yeah,
because
it's quite unfortunate because
yeah,
Leibniz was a controversial figure. He had some problems with Newton, as you know. They had a dispute about who really invented calculus and so on. So yeah, he was embroiled with that controversy. And he was, I think, more of a politician as well. So Leibniz was, as you've said, he's a polymath. He's all around.
mm,
But really, the
mhm,
idea of what's his quotable quote? He's hoping that in all sciences, right, all the scientists in the world would later have a language wherein if they have a dispute, scientists have a dispute, they can all sit down and just tabulate. And that's what we're doing now. So his dream of having that characteristic language, I think, happened now in the 20th century or even in the 19th century when they were developing symbolic logic as we know it.
basically instead of arguing verbally, let's sit down and calculate, right? That's what he said.
Calculate.
Let's calculate,
Let's
right?
use this language, right? And let's
Right.
just tabulate. Let's calculate everything. And that's, I
Okay.
think, as I've said, it's happening now. If you see the logic textbooks or the logic journals, they're just using the same language. It's not until the 20th century that that was really, I think, became the rule. You had that the standard language. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Now we should move on to the man named Bolzano. Right. So it was actually the first time that I heard his name while reading the book. So I was kind of shocked when, when I learned that this dude gets rarely talked about as actually, a massive contribution in logic, particularly when, dealing with scientific reasoning generally. So he was a Czech
Yeah.
philosopher, mathematician, logician, and even a Catholic priest. Although he lived during the same period as George Bull, but according to many accounts, many of his groundbreaking ideas went largely unnoticed during his lifetime. So, yeah, so Dr. JJ, can you tell us what was Bolzano's greatest contribution in the field, formal logic?
Okay, so let's imagine we are in the 18th century going to the 19th century. So this is after Leibniz. This is during Euler's time. So Leonhard Euler, a mathematician, Carl Friedrich Gauss, another mathematician, Humboldt, a biologist, so on. And you have Kant, Immanuel Kant. So this is the time where the German universities were being established. So Groningen, and so on. So these are really cool people in Germany and Prussia who are trying to establish, universities. Bolzano is coming here as one of those leading professors of mathematics and theology and philosophy. One thing that's unique about Bolzano is that he's thinking about logic as a way to systematize all other sciences. We talked about it in Leibniz a while ago, no? So Leibniz is looking for a language, common language that scientists around the world could share. Bolzano extended that because he noticed that, wait, so psychology has that logi. You have biology that has logos as well, logi. You have those things, the logical part. So all sciences have a logic. So for Bolzano, that's why logic is the science of logic itself. So if you think about how biologists can communicate their ideas with chemists and how chemists discusses their work with physicists and so on. So you have those desperate separate areas of sciences. Looks like they're not really talking to each other, but actually they share a common core, and that's the logic core. So I think one of the initial contributions of Bolzano is actually to have that core idea that logic is the core that makes all the sciences work. It's the heart. Actually, that idea came from Aristotle too. The organon logic is the first science in a way that it's the tool that we use to talk about all the sciences. But Bolzano has that idea that logic is actually talking about a realm. So he has that three realm idea. So you have mental, the world, the mental, and this third realm where logic is. So it connects those two things. For example, a while ago I'm talking about Aristotle, and Aristotle's logic is about the world. For the medievals, at least some of them, like Peter Abelard, they'll say logic, or even the Stoic, they'll say that logic is not really about the world, but it's about the mental language we use to talk about the world. Now, for Bolzano, those are two things. You have the world, so logic is about that too. It's about the mental realm, mental language that we use to talk about the world. But logic itself has a different, and that is what connects the two. Are you getting that picture? So that three world view, right? So you have the three worlds: the world of reality itself, the world that you conceive of it, and the connection between the two, and that's logic, and that's where logic will come. Actually, that kind of idea inspired, people like Husserl, Edmund Husserl, in his logical investigations to have that distinction between the noumena and the noema. Sorry, the noumena and those things, the noema, the phenomenon, right? The Kantian idea, the distinction. Bolzano was trying to bridge that using that third realm. Husserl had that. Gottlob Frege had that as well. So he was that that leading figure that you know trying to figure out how these all these sciences relate to one another, and they're related because of this third realm of logic. But you're right, as you have said, Bolzano is really not that famous as a
Mhm.
pioneer of logic because you have people like George Boole in the UK, in England, you have John Venn, Lewis Carroll, which is a different strand of development of logic.
Right, right. And also, I'm quite interested about his idea of propositions because it resembles our modern conception of what a proposition like. Take, for example, the Stoics and the medieval logicians, right? They think of propositions sort of a mental item that would only exist if you author them. So that's why they have the problem of conditionals, right? Because you can have a conditional which you author the antecedent, yet you could have failed to author the consequent end. It's very problematic in their time. So because Bolzano think of propositions as a mind, you know, in language
Independent.
independent entities, it's kind of he has an account of these, better account of conditionals as opposed to those previous
No,
logicians as well.
actually, that's a good point about conditionals. I think some people have written about that as well. I have a friend who worked on that idea. Frege had that idea too. So you're right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good way of putting it. So the Aristotelians were concerned about reality. The Stoics and the medievals were concerned about the mental thing. It's actually the psychology of psychologism of logic that we get from Franz Brentano and stemming from Kant. But now you have this guy, Bolzano, who would say, no, there's a connection between the two because you have that logic that connects the two, which is
Right,
which
right.
is not just in the world, it's extra linguistic, it's extra mental, But it's not in the physical world as well. It's in the third realm that he calls the logical realm. Yeah.
Exactly. And has including his account of explanation, which is his grounding principles, things like that. A very interesting one as well.
I think
So
he could say that because, as we've said, it's logic is not about reality. Logic is not about what's in the mind or what's in language. Logic is about, you know, this thing here. And it gives you ways to talk about how those two things relate or how explanations in general work or how, you know, the grounding relations, as you've said, work or the dependency relation work as well. Actually, this
okay,
is a good springboard to. So that's the German side of the development of logic in the 19th century. And you have the British side and the American side. So actually, you could cut across these developments already here.
okay. Thanks so much, Dr. JJ. So okay, now let us consider Bull, the person who have tried to reduce logic into mathematics, and just like Leibniz. Think it is said that his algebraic logic marked the transition from the Aristotelian tradition in logic. Although, but despite that, Aristotelian logic continues its dominance among scholarly textbook and articles in his time. So Bull was an English mathematician who, despite leaving school at the age of 16 to support his family, continued to educate himself in mathematics, and eventually became a professor. So, all right. So now let me ask you this question, Dr. JJ. So what was Bull's main contribution to logic, and why is he considered as one of those pioneers of modern logic?
Well, for me, he's the father of modern symbolic logic. We owe a lot to no his work, the laws of thought or mathematical logic. So he's the first guy who had the insight of mathematizing logic. So the algebra that was named after him, Boolean algebra, which uses numbers 1 and 0, which uses arithmetical symbols like the addition, the complementation, the negation, the subset relation. It all came from him. But it's not just him. Actually, it's fun to think about this. So the Germans, okay, the people in the continent like Bolzano, Husserl, even Frege later, you have a more philosophical way of looking at logic, a lot of metaphysics there. But here, the English or the UK people will have a more pragmatic way of looking logic. And it's more of how to mathematize the idea. Like one of the interesting, by the way, it's as I've said, it's not just George Boole. You also have John Venn, the Venn diagram that we know came from him. You also have Lewis Carroll, Charles Ludwig Dodson. So Lewis Carroll, you know him from his work Alice in Wonderland. He was not just a writer; he was a brilliant mathematician and a logician. Right? So Lewis Carroll has this game of logic. So these were the contemporaries of George Boole. So the idea of mathematizing logic came from Leibniz. That's right. But it wasn't until these guys really tried to incorporate mathematical terms, mathematical functions into logic. It's not until then that we have modern symbolic logic. So one of the key ideas of Boole is to think about truths and falsities as functions, right? Like something is true if it's turned on, so that's one. Something is false if it's turned off, so that's zero. So you only have two values there, one and zero. And if you have those numbers, one and zero, then you could have some kind of arithmetic, an algebra to work with those numbers. So for example, the sum of a truth and a falsity is a truth. Sum, the plus sign for Boole, is your disjunction in the Stoics. if you say that either we're having a podcast here or we're eating lunch, it's true that we're having a podcast. It's false that we're eating lunch. So that disjunction, that plus in Boolean algebra will result to a true. And so that's how, you know, Boole really, I think a good way of putting him is that he further formalized logic as we know it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And I also think Bull, would you agree to me that Bull is the polar opposite of Frege? Because, well, Frege tried to reduce mathematics, mathematics to logic. On the other hand, what Bull did is to reduce logic into pure mathematics.
I think there's another way of putting it, a better way of putting it. At least
Okay.
if you think about the history of the development of logic and philosophy during that time. So Boole's project was, his key insight was, Aristotle was right? In a way, logic is about the laws of thought, but the laws of thought can be mathematics. We could use arithmetic, basic arithmetical function, and we could incorporate logic within that framework. So instead of thinking about, all men or all human beings will die, he'll say that the class of human beings belong or is a subset of the class of all things that will die. And so that's a kind of set relationship instead of thinking about it in terms of categories or properties. So it's no longer about properties. It's no longer metaphysics. You're no longer thinking about philosophy. You're already thinking about it in terms of math. That's why, the development of computer science as well, you could trace that back to George Boole. Frege, Gottlieb Frege, has a different project. His project was, how should we think about mathematics? What is the foundation of our mathematical statements? For example, the statement that A is A, that's an equation. So what do we mean by to say that two things are identical? So he'll have a metaphysical theory to think about that, or a philosophical theory. But what we get from Frege is another way of characterizing how the formal relations between information could be arrived at. By the way, so Frege came a bit later than Boole. So Boole was early 19th century. So Frege came in later in the 19th century. His monumental work was published in the 1870s, while Boole, I think, in the 1811s or 1810s to 1820s. So that's a bit of far relation in terms of dates. But yeah, that's a good question. Actually, it's fun to think about how those lives were really interacting during the 19th century. Because you also have the Americans, right? Like Charles Sanders Peirce, who's working, and C.I. Lewis, who's working in the US. This was early 19th century US, where they were developing also alongside what's going on in the European continent and what's going on in the British Isles. Imagine that. These three people, Peirce, Boole, and Frege, and Bolzano as well, they're all working independent of one another, and yet they're working on the same thing. Actually, what's happening there is that this was when, people like the mathematicians were interacting now with, the philosophers and they were interacting with the scientists, and they're trying to figure out, is there a way to unite these sciences into one? That's the Bolzano project. That's the Frege project. That's a Boole project as well. And even Charles Sanders Peirce, C.S. Peirce, he was talking about that, the unity of the sciences as well.
Right. Okay. Okay, that's good.
By the way,
So,
that's
yeah,
why
okay.
I'm really excited here, because my foreign research is in the early 20th century development of logic. So that's why I'm really excited to talk about these things.
Right. No worries, Dr. JJ. I like it when you're, very enthusiastic about those things. Okay.
Yeah.
So that is good. Now let us move on to the man named C.S. Peirce. I think he is one of those people who, seem interested about almost everything. He was a philosopher, just like Leibniz, a scientist and a mathematician, perhaps, can say all at once. So Peirce introduced modern quantifiers like for every, there exists, like the universal, the existential life, which, yeah, and it also developed the calculus of relations and invented these so-called diagrammatic systems for doing logical proofs. In fact, many of his ideas, right, that students learn in predicate logic today can be traced back to Peirce's work. So, Dr. JJ, what was C.S. Peirce's major contribution to logic?
So as I've said, Charles Sanders Peirce, it's by the way pronounced as Peirce, not Pierce. It's Peirce. Okay. So Peirce, Boole, and Frege, if you want to trace the history of modern symbolic logic, you trace it from them. These three people. Boole in the UK, Peirce in the US, and Frege in the European continent. Hi. So Peirce was, as you have said, he's not just a logician, he's a brilliant mathematician. He's also an amateur scientist. Unfortunately, he had a bad life. He was poor all the way. He was, I think, an obsessive gambler, right? He had a bad reputation among his peers as well. He was friends with William James and Oliver Wendell Holmes, if you're familiar with those US people. All right, so they're part of this group, the pragmatist group. So if in Boole's time you have John Venn, Lewis Carroll, I forgot to mention Augustus De Morgan. The De Morgan theorem came from him. So those English people were working independent of the Peirce people. So Peirce was working with a way of thinking about relations, like how does A relate to another thing B? And there are multiple ways of thinking about relationship. So the relationship may be a reflexive relationship. It relates to itself. It might be a symmetric relationship. They relate to one another and vice versa. It might be a transitive relationship or whatever kind of relationship. So Peirce started that. And during this time, the quantifiers you're talking about, actually, it was being developed as well during Frege's time in 1879, the Begriffsschrift. So Frege was here in the continent doing quantifier logic to ground the basic foundations of mathematics. Boole was working in, I think he was in Ireland, in Cork University, and he was trying to figure out how to mathematize Aristotle. And you have Peirce, who's a scientist primarily, who was an epistemologist as well. He was thinking about how could we have a unified science, and all of them arrive at almost the same features of what symbolic logic or the modern symbolic logic we know now. Yeah, so that's Peirce. So you talked about his existential graph. So he's famous also with some kind of diagram technique in figuring out syllogisms, validity of syllogisms. But he's not the only one who's doing that. So as I said, John Venn was doing that. Even Euler, the mathematician Leonard Euler, was doing that a couple of centuries back. And you have even Lewis Carroll, right? He has that kind of diagrammatic approach to logic as well. But these guys were really at the frontiers of logical research. They were ushering in what will happen in the 20th century.
Right, exactly. And I think this were kind of a transition as well from Aristotelian to modern logic because, since Peirce turned universal affirmative statements into conditional, such as for all x, if x is A, then A is B, relations such as subalternations no longer work. We can no longer infer a particular affirmative proposition from a universal affirmative proposition, right? Because given that it is possible for the universal affirmative statement to be true and yet the particular affirmative proposition to be false. And the reason behind this is because conditionals themselves, their nature, they do not assert anything, right? Given P, if P is true, then it follows Q, right? Something like that. But on the other hand, existential statements like they're in form of conjunction, so they assert. So if either of those conjuncts is false, then entirely the existential statement is false. That's why these kind of relations no longer work in his system. Am I right, Dr. JJ?
Yeah, in a way. So Peirce has that idea. Poole had that idea as well, and Frege, of course, had that idea. But actually, if you think about it, in the history of logic, it was John Venn who the inventor of the Venn diagram, who first noticed that kind of, well, they call it the fallacy of what's the existential fallacy. He was one of the
Mm-hmm.
first who really observed that kind of thing. But here's the here. Let's go back to Aristotle and let's see why this is a problem for modern logicians. All right. So for Aristotle, if you say, as I've said, my favorite example right now, all human beings will die. You have that category, human being, and the things that will die, and you have that kind of, well, real relationship between them. Because you're saying that all human beings will die. You're saying that for every human being, that thing will die. Now, when modern logicians came in, like Poole, John Venn, Peirce, even Gottlob Frege, they noticed that, well, the universal statement is not really claiming that there are human beings. It's only saying that if there are human beings, for every human being, they will die. So notice that that became no longer a categorical statement. It's no longer a statement about here's the property of being human, here's the property of being whatever, going to die, and you're merging those two properties. Now you're saying that, well, a universal is just a disguised conditional statement that for every human being, for everything in the universe, right, if it is a human being, it will die. But a conditional need not presuppose the truth of the antecedent for it to be true. So now you're going back to the Stoics, right? The Stoics will say, like Philo would say, well, you could have a conditional with a false antecedent. So that's right, right? So the existential fallacy supposedly committed by Aristotle is to say a fallacy is that whenever you have a general claim or a universal claim, you're assuming that the subject of the universal claim exists. Actually, the problem was also, I think, was also observed by Alexius Meinong, one of those Germans who Bertrand Russell hates. So, like the idea that all unicorns have horns. How can you say that that's true? Well, that seems false because there are no unicorns. Now, modern logicians would say, well, that's true if something is a unicorn, it has horns. Then it has horns. That statement will be true. This is where, the development of, quantifier logic, predicate logic, as we know it now, will come into fruition. And actually, it's helpful in mathematics, as we'll see later when we talk about Bertrand Russell, Frege, and so on.
All right. That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. JJ. Okay, so yep, I think we move on to most often mentioned logicians in any logic textbook, and of course, he's none other than Gottlob Frege, right? And I believe you've been waiting to talk about this guy. So he's often credited as the man who single-handedly invented modern logic. So finally breaking it free from its restrictive Aristotelian tradition. He was also the one who, in a sense, resolved the long-standing divide between Aristotelian and Stoic logic by giving them commonplace within a single logical framework. Okay, so now, Dr. JJ, let me ask you this question. What was Frege's greatest contribution to logic?
Again, so the history of logic won't be as we know it now without this guy. We can trace back to Poole, to Peirce. But Frege was very important, not just to logic, not just to mathematics, but to philosophy itself. Because he was not just the founder of modern logic, he's also the founder of analytic philosophy, some people would say. Now, Frege was not really a philosopher, unfortunately. He was a mathematician, and he was concerned about foundational questions in mathematics. So he was working on, you know, I think his work was on number theory. So number theory is concerned about, well, what are numbers in the first place? What do we mean when we say that there are two things there? What does two mean here, or whatever? So Gottlob Frege in the 1870s down to his death in the 1900s, early 1900s, he tried to really capture the basic idea of how do we ground mathematics. And he did that using some really peculiar ideas in logic. All right, so he's known for, I think, three main books. So he has that concept notation, or Begriffsschrift in German. He has the Grundlagen, the foundations of mathematics, I think, and the basic laws. Grundgesetze. All right, so those are the three main works. But what he's trying to figure out is, if I have a mathematical statement, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by an equation? What do I mean by saying that here's a number? Or what do I mean by certain arithmetical formulations and so on? So what he did was to introduce a notation. Okay, that's why his first work was concept notation, to really figure out those things. Okay, so in the 20th century, or the early part of 20th century, he ventured into more philosophy of language. So he has the sense of reference, he has the thought, and all those things. So the things that analytic philosophers have been debating about ever since, can be traced back to the Phrygian turn in the 19th century. So as I've said, Boole, Peirce, Frege, I'll say that they're the main foundations of modern symbolic logic as we know it.
Okay. Was it true though that logic itself became truly modern when logic itself became an object of mathematical study, which is what we now call as metalogic? Became
Or
modern in that sense. Yeah, in that sense.
it became more mathematical, that's right. But it wasn't until, Bertrand Russell came in
Mhm.
that, in his, you know, I'll discuss it now. So Russell, Bertrand Russell was integral here because of his Principia Mathematica, which he co-wrote with Whitehead. So Frege, Boole, and Peirce in the 19th century were developing a mathematical way of presenting logic. But there was no real language of logic yet. Right? The language, the notations that we know now, that modern logicians are using, contemporary logicians are using, did not come from Boole or Frege. Frege's notation was really cumbersome because he's using weird lines, and it will take a whole page just to prove a particular formula. It wasn't until Russell, owing to the works of Giuseppe Piano in the turn of the 19th century, 20th century, that logic became really an object of mathematics. It became not just a province of philosophy, right? It became the province of mathematics as well. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And you mentioned his kind of complicated notation. It is actually one of the reasons why, according to many accounts, why Frege's, his bridge frame, how do you say, the concept script receive a very little
Begriffsschrift. Yeah.
big bridge script, right? So it received a very little recognition due to his complex, awkward, logical notations. And also it was later on found to be logical inconsistent due to Russell's paradox, right? It was Russell who exposed weakness in Frege's logical system. And yeah, so, and also like, I remembered his kind of view about mathematical objects. Like these are necessarily existing objects in his sort of mathematical realism view. It is indispensable, right? And because of the successive scientific theories, things like that, it implies that they exist. So yeah, we've talked about Frege. Okay, so perhaps it's time to talk about piano and Bertrand Russell. Can you tell us here, Dr. JJ, what was the main contribution of Giuseppe Piano and Bertrand Russell? Why they were so important?
So again, this is the turn of the 20th century. Mathematicians. Here's a funny story about this development in logic. It was the 1900s, as in 1900, 1900, the turn of the 20th century, when mathematicians, logicians, physicists from all over the world came to Paris, right, to talk about the foundations of the sciences. That is where it's a big conference. It's like the World Congress of Philosophy during the time. It's a big conference. I think Frege was there. David Hilbert was there. Russell was there. Giuseppe Piano, and a student of Charles Sander Peirce, Lad Franklin, Christine Glad Franklin was also there. All right, so the topic on the agenda was the foundations of the sciences, the mathematics, and so on. Russell came to the conference. Well, he has I think one good book by during that time. He was writing the Principles of Mathematics. Okay, but he encountered this weird Italian guy, Giuseppe Piano. We can't help but notice that in all debates, this is Russell's account in his autobiography. Russell said that in all debates that he encountered Giuseppe Piano, Piano was debating other people. He can't notice but this guy, Piano, was winning the argument all the time. He asked himself, why is that? And he noticed that Giuseppe Piano was using a really good notation that streamlined all, ways of thinking into minute apparatus in the mathematics or the formalization or the algebra. Right? So that's what Russell got from Piano. And it's the early incarnation, right? The piano, it's known as the piano arithmetic. So that's the early incarnation of set theory as was developed in the 20th century. So Russell got that notation from Giuseppe Piano, and he introduced that kind of notation. The notation that you have V for the disjunction, the dot for conjunction, the horseshoe for the hook for conditional, that came from Piano. That's the Piano arithmetic. All right. So Russell introduced that to Cambridge, and his colleagues in Cambridge, like Alfred North Whitehead, learned that notation, and from then on, now logicians until now are using Russellian notation in doing their work. So a lot of symbolic logic uses the Russell notation. So that's the main contribution of Russell. As you have said, Russell was also one of those guys who are interested in the foundations of mathematics, and he was a logicist like Frege. He wants to, reduce all mathematics to logic. He wants to bring mathematics to a firm logical foundation. And that was the project of the Principia Mathematica, his monumental work. However, he noticed that there was a problem in Frege's Foundations of Mathematics. And that's where the Russell paradox will come in. Because I don't want to get into the details of this one, but really that is the starting point of the development of logic in the 1920s and 30s.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. KJ.
Yes.
Okay, so I think we can now move on to one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, which is David Hilbert. And by the way, I always hear his name, which is mentioned by Dr. William Lane Craig in his debate to support the idea that there couldn't be an actual infinite through the famous thought experiment known as Hilbert's Hotel. So could you introduce us to David, Hilbert, at least?
Okay. David Hilbert, German mathematician, one of the best. And in the same conference that I was talking about, the Paris conference of 1900, David Hilbert was there to pronounce
the program for all mathematicians to do. He set the 23 problems of mathematicians, right, alongside with and they call it the Hilbert program. Wait, I just remembered that you talked about William Craig. Yeah, I remember that. That's a really bad argument. But never mind. So David Hilbert came to the Paris conference to really set the agenda for modern mathematicians. So he asked mathematicians to prove the consistency of mathematics. He asked mathematicians to really, solve the unsolved problems like the Riemann hypothesis, Cantor, sorry, the what's that? I think Euler or Poincare conjecture or whatever. So he has a set of problems. He laid down those problems in the 1900s. What's also interesting about Hilbert, alongside with his student Ackermann, they also developed this kind of notation. Right? So if in Burton Russell, Whitehead, piano, you have the conditional like the horseshoe. Hilbert and Ackermann notation was the arrow. And most mathematicians use the Hilbert-Ackermann notation for their mathematics. And most logicians who are philosophers use the Russell. And so that's one of the contributions of Hilbert. But the important thing that Hilbert really gave us is that problem about the consistency of mathematics. How can you prove the consistency of mathematics? How can you say that all true mathematical statements are provable? That's one of the important problems that he raised during the 1900 Paris conference.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. JJ. Okay. So, yeah. So down to the last two before we move on to our fun questions. I actually designed these fun questions just to get to you personally. So, by the way, you can answer these questions briefly since we don't want to take up much of your time, Dr. JJ.
Mhm.
So now we move on to Kurt Gödel. I'm very excited to talk about this guy because it was Russell, right, who exposed Frege's logical system, and then it was Gödel himself who showed why Russell and Whitehead project reducing mathematics single formal logical system was ultimately incomplete. So Dr. JJ, can you tell us Gödel's famous or his at least greatest contribution in logic?
Kurt Gödel was part of the Vienna Circle. By the way, I was in their office. The office where Gödel, discussed this theorem. I was there last year and it was really wow, amazing place. So yeah, Kurt Gödel was a member of the Vienna Circle, the group of philosophers, mathematicians, logicians, sociologists, and so on, who aim to have really a scientific worldview. Hi. Now, I mentioned that one of David Hilbert's problem was to prove the consistency of Gödel. Kurt Gödel proved that you can't do that. Right? That's his famous contribution. It's known as the incompleteness theorem. Now, it's been 2 hours now since we started this podcast. But let's go back to the liar paradox. Because that's the insight that Gödel had. So Gödel thought, okay, so Principia Mathematica was trying to consolidate all mathematics into one logical foundation. And that's, David Hilbert, in his mind, in the 1910s and 1920s, in their minds, Russell, we have the language to really prove that all mathematics is consistent. And by extension, mathematics can be completed. You could have a whole complete mathematics. Now, in 1929, 1930s, before World War II, Kurt Gödel observed that there's a problem with that project. And it's the same problem that the liar paradox has been saying a millennia ago or two millennia ago. Okay? What's the problem? The problem is, so the liar paradox tells you that this statement is false, is true if it is false. It's false if it is true. Okay, so you can't have that. So if you have a self-referential statement like that within a given language, a mathematical language like the Principia Mathematica, then you can't prove it's true. Okay, so here's the genius of the Gödel argument. To say that mathematics is complete, right, means that all true sentences in that mathematics is provable. You could prove all true sentences in that language. How about the sentence, this sentence is not provable? Can you prove that in your system? That's a shortcut way of really giving you the theorem, but that's the basic idea. So you have a mathematical statement. Let's say the statement that this statement cannot be proved. If it is true, then you can't prove it. So how can you have a completeness proof if you can't prove that statement, if it's true? If it is false, then you could prove it, but that means that the system is not consistent because now you have a false sentence within the system. So that's a famous second incompleteness theorem, which was celebrated in the 1930s. Actually, this also paved way to the development of Alan Turing's ideas of the universal computing machine that we later codified in the computers that we use right now.
Right.
So that's
Right.
yeah, so it's fun really to think about those developments there in the early part of the 20th century. Imagine you have David Hilbert talking about the foundations of mathematics in 1900. Then by 1931, you have this weird looking, he's not really German, he's Czech, I think. So Kurt Gödel, a weird looking Czech guy, telling him, we can't do this because not all provable statements are true, or not all true statements can be proved in this system, whatever that system may be. Okay? Imagine that. In just 30 years, you have this result. And yeah, it's so cool.
It's massive, basically. Okay, so I would also like to ask this question regarding the implication of his first and second incompleteness theorem concerning topics in metaphysics or perhaps epistemology. If you can connect it in some sense, like what is the implication of his?
A lot of people say that the incompleteness theorem, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, will tell you that we can't know everything. All right, so that's the epistemic thing that you could derive from that. I'm not sure that that's a good conclusion that you could derive from the Gödel theorem because uh, Gödel's theorem is, I think, misunderstood in the past how many decades. It's not about knowledge, it's about language. Here's a body of a language, and the language does not have enough resources to talk about itself. I think that's another way of appreciating Gödel's theorem. But some metaphysicians, some philosophers of mind, I think, and some epistemologists would say that Gödel has proven that we have incomplete knowledge of reality. Or Gödel has proven that artificial intelligence can never be conscious or can never think because it can't prove itself. Whatever, man. That's not what Gödel is talking about in his theory. But some did, like Craig, like Roger Penrose. I think also used that kind of argument, but I'm not sure that that's a good way of using Gödel's theorem.
Okay, so those were
I think.
Okay,
I think.
right. So finally, we now arrive to the last figure in our discussion, and that is, of course, none other than Tarski himself. Actually invented this name, right? Without any clear history behind it. His real name wasn't Tarski, right?
No.
But just kind of invented thing because due to the Holocaust thing. So he was the youngest, according to the count history, to be ever awarded, one by the University of Warsaw. So unlike many logicians we talk about today, Tarski didn't revolutionize logic by really inventing an entirely new logical system. So what he's more concerned about, according to the textbook that I read, is that one of the oldest, deepest questions in philosophy itself, which is a question that goes all the way back to Aristotle. What does it actually mean for a statement to be true, right? So, Dr. JJ, can you introduce us to Alfred Tarski? What was his main contribution to the field of logic?
He was a member of another group of philosophers in Poland. It's known as the 𝐉𝐞𝐈𝐒𝐓𝐎𝐑𝐘 school. They have connections with the Vienna Circle. Actually, it's funny to think about this generation of philosophers too. That's why I mentioned a while ago that 20th century, 21st century logic and philosophy is like the medieval times. A lot of activities going on right now, the same as the medievals during their time. Okay, so Tarski, as you've said, that's not his real name. I forgot his real name, but that's his American name. He adopted that when he migrated to the US post-war. Oh, sorry, during the war. Okay, so he's one of the members, as I've said, of the Warsaw School of Logic, or the Warsaw Lvov School of Logic, or the Polish logicians. And their leader was Jan Lukasiewicz, who introduced, a way of thinking about logic, not just in terms of the Boolean algebra of 1 and 0, but extending the logic to add other values inside that. So you could have a fuzzy logic where the values may have a range from 0 to 1. You could have weird logics, that the logics I'm working on right now, the glotty logic, which could have, contradictions inside the system and so on. But what's interesting about Tarski, right, and later developments in I think 1950s and 60s down to today, was his introduction of modal theory. So this is not just, this is not logic. It's more of a meta logic. It's a way to talk about logic, right? In Aristotle's time, they were concerned about truth. They're concerned about validity. Until now, we're concerned about that. But there's no real language by which we can use, the same mathematical devices to talk about those things, truths and the consequence relation. And Tarski, I think, I designed the way to talk about truths and falsities within, logic itself. Now he calls that we call it now the T schema, or the Tarski schema. All right, that some sentence is true if and only if what it says is true. Right? But it's actually not just that correspondence, but it's a way to talk about the sentences within the system of logic as part of a meta language that talks about the system itself. This is just technical way of putting, if you know the truth table, right? The truth table in current logic,
Right.
we owe that to the model theory that Tarski eventually developed. Actually, just to give you some ideas, it's not really Tarski who invented that. Even Charles Sanders Peirce has that. Ludwig Wittgenstein already had that in the Tractatus. The American Emil Post also had that kind of model theoretic way of thinking about truths and falsities and the validity of arguments. But it wasn't until Tarski that idea was codified into a real formal language that we are now adapting in current model theory. So I myself, I'm working on model theory. So model theory is just a kind of logical device to talk about logics. Okay, so there are different logics, right? You have the piano logic, you have the Aristotle's logic, but you could use a kind of device, the model device, to talk about those logics, right? And really decipher what's going on. That's why in the 1940s, 1950s, logic became officially a branch of mathematics. So I don't know if you encountered discrete mathematics in your studies. You had, right?
I haven't yet, but I was kind of planning to study discrete mathematics because I would like to go higher level, like second order logic. I'm studying predicate logic right now. So yeah.
No, because in your GE math, the math in the modern world, if you have encountered the math in the
Okay.
that
I'm
course,
not really good at that. I'm so sorry.
that's all right. I'm just saying that the design of that course is really tracing back to the mathematization of logic since George Boole, Gottlob Frege, and C.S. Peirce. And you have the model theory, the truth table coming in, the quantifiers coming in. By the way, some people have asked me to teach a math in the modern world because I'm starting with set theory as the foundation of mathematics. So set theory plus logic will give you all of mathematics. And that's we owe it to Aristotle and the rest of the gang that we have this kind
Okay,
of
the rest.
machinery.
The rest of the okay. All right. So now, yeah, all done. We finished 14 important figures. So now we move on to the fun parts. Actually, I usually ask this to my guest. So this is where our viewers get to know you personally, not just as a philosopher, Dr. Joaquin. Since I don't want to take much of your time, once again, you can answer these questions briefly if you like. So maybe we should start with the first question. Now, what is your favorite food?
Favorite food? Right now, I'm paella, Spanish paella.
How do you pronounce it?
Paella in Filipino, but
Paella, Spanish food. Okay, it's
paella.
paella. It's not that, guys. Okay. The second question that we have right here is that what was your undergrad thesis and why you chose the topic
My
as
under
a philosophy student in college?
my undergrad thesis was on the modal logic of Claro Arceniza. I picked that because I thought it was the easiest way to do the research, but no, it wasn't because Claro Arceniza, one of the foremost philosophers that we produce in the country, I developed a really interesting metaphysical system that talked about modal logic. So from then on, I was hooked to logic.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so third question, do you have any hobbies that you enjoy, perhaps sports, music, or anything that you like during your free time?
Free time, I play guitar. I do chess puzzles. What else? I'm a professional editor. That's my free time. So I edit some things on Wikipedia. So that's my pastime.
Really?
Yes. If I hate the write up or I fact check things, yeah, that's my hobby too.
Okay, thank you so much for that one. All right, so fourth question, who is your most favorite philosopher of all time and why?
All time? Okay, all time. Not sure. I have a lot of philosophical heroes, but my favorite philosopher right now is Arthur Pryor. He's a New
Art
Zealand
or
Arthur Pryor. So
yeah.
Prior. He's a philosophical
Mm-hmm.
hero. He's known for temporal logic, the history of logic. He introduced Polish notation into Americans and Australians. Yeah, so
Okay.
I wrote a lot of work on I worked on Arthur Pryor's philosophy for during the pandemic. So yeah, doing a lot of
Okay.
prior work. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Joaquin. So fifth question, if you had the chance to travel back in time and spend an entire day, right? A conversation with just one philosopher, who would you choose and what questions would you most want to ask them?
Actually, that's a good question. I haven't thought of that question for a while. But if I were given the opportunity to go back in time, I'd like to meet one of my philosophical heroes, Peter Abelard. I'd like to meet him. He looks like a cool guy. He had a lot of affairs, I think. He's a good logician. He trained as a priest. He must be a fascinating guy. So yeah, I'd like to meet Peter Abelard. Yeah.
Right. And what are those questions that you would like to ask to Peter, if you have any questions?
He has this work, his Historia Calamitatum, the history of my calamities. So I'd like to ask, Which of those is the most hurtful for you? His calamities.
Okay,
He was famous for his relationship with Eloise, if you're familiar. There's a
I'm
love
not familiar with
story
them.
between Peter Abelard and Eloise. Yeah, fascinating guy.
Okay, thank you. All right, sixth question. And let us imagine the scenario. So, an all knowing oracle suddenly appears before you and allows you to ask only one question. What would that question be?
And he can answer truthfully.
It's so paradoxical again.
Okay, so if
Situation
he
that
could
is
answer
assuming.
truthfully, and what question? No, I won't ask any questions to that oracle. Why? Because I'd like to figure things out for myself.
Wow, that was cool. Okay, last two questions, Dr. JJ. So, Stephen Hawking once said that
Philosophy is
philosophy is
dead.
dead. Yeah, because it's not kept up with developments in modern science. So, how would you respond to the people who claim that philosophy is no longer useful today?
There's a funny answer. The claim that philosophy is dead is a philosophical claim. So sorry, Stephen Hawking, you're doing philosophy, uttering that. But there's a more serious answer to that question. Well, philosophy is something that, all of us have undertaken or undertaking whenever you are reflecting on things. So you can't help but do philosophy. Philosophy is not dead. Can't die,
Exactly.
actually.
The philosophy is not dead. Okay, so for our
Oh,
final
wait,
question,
let me qualify
okay,
that. So long as there are reflective individuals. Of course, if there's no reflective individual in the universe, there's no philosophy there.
okay. Thank you so much, Dr. JJ. So for our last question, what advice would you give to people who are considering studying philosophy? What can they expect to learn or experience from engaging with this discipline, Professor?
Yeah, so philosophy is a good discipline to get into because if you want to hone your thinking skills, reading skills, critical thinking skills, and so on, philosophy is a good way to go. That's the practical side of it. But obviously, I'm going back to Socrates. An unexamined life is not worth living. So philosophy will give you, ways to think about your life and whether it's worth living. So yeah, my advice, get into
Hmm.
philosophy if you want to get the thinking skills, the reading skills, if you want to think a lot of weird problems. Okay? Because those things are, in learning how to think well and reading well, it will give you all the skills you need in real life. But on the other hand, what's bad about philosophy is if you learn about, you know, meaning of life questions, God questions, and all those real philosophical questions, you might not get into practical things anyway, because you'll be more concerned about whether your life is worth living, which is also a good way to live your life.
Wonderful message. All right, so we will end it here. So, Dr. JJ, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our listeners did as well. And by the way, guys, if you have enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel and allows us to continue having conversation like this. So, thank you so much once again, Professor, and have a wonderful ahead. Goodbye for
Thanks.
now. Thank you so much.